The dog. It all started with a quiet life in a sunny suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, pastel-painted homes, and lawns that looked like they had been cut with scissors. To most, it was a picture of peace. For one family, however, that illusion shattered the day a new neighbor moved in, a woman who would later come to be known, almost unanimously, as the Karen of the block. The family had lived there for years, raising their kids and enjoying the company of their golden retriever, Max. Max wasn't just a pet, he was part of the family, a gentle, calm, endlessly patient dog. He had grown up alongside the children. He rarely barked, preferring to lounge in the sun or trot happily on walks. In fact, many neighbors often commented on how unusually well-behaved he was. But Karen didn't see a beloved pet. To her, Max was the perfect target. Karen was impossible to ignore. With her sharp bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and habit of standing at the window with crossed arms, she seemed to make it her life's mission to police the neighborhood. Within weeks of moving in, she began issuing warnings to her neighbors, though she had no authority to do so. She would scold people for leaving recycling bins out too long, complain about cars parked on the street, and glare at kids playing too loudly. But when she noticed Max, her obsession found new fuel. One morning, the family received their first HOA notice in the mail. It claimed there had been multiple complaints of excessive dog barking, disturbing the neighborhood's peace. The family was confused. Max barely barked unless startled, and certainly not for long stretches of time. Thinking it was just a misunderstanding, they brushed it off. But then came the second notice. Then the third, each more sternly worded, each warning that fines would follow. The family soon discovered that every single complaint came from Karen. She had even taken it upon herself to call animal control. When the officer arrived, clipboard in hand, he observed Max quietly lounging in the yard. The officer chuckled, scribbled something, and told the family not to worry. There was nothing wrong here. But Karen wasn't satisfied. Her next move was more extreme. She called the police. On a bright Saturday morning, 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the house. The family stood in disbelief as Karen stormed out of her home, waving her arms wildly, pointing at the golden retriever sitting calmly on the porch. She claimed the dog was aggressive, dangerous, and barking incessantly. Yet, in front of everyone, Max simply wagged his tail, tongue lolling, as if mocking her lies. The officers quickly realized nothing was wrong and left with a polite apology. Still, the damage was done. The family now had a record with the HOA, claiming their dog was a nuisance. And worse, the HOA, board known for its strict, sometimes unfair, enforcement, took Karen's side. They began sending fines, insisting the family had to control their dog or face escalating penalties. It was infuriating. The family tried to reason with the HOA, showing them notes from animal control, even offering to let board members meet Max themselves. But the HOA wouldn't budge. It was clear Karen had gotten to them, whispering in their ears, pushing her narrative of a problem dog. As weeks went by, the harassment only grew. Karen would stand at her window with her phone pointed to the family's yard. Pretending to record evidence, she would march past their house, muttering under her breath about irresponsible pet owners. Sometimes, she would even stage fake scenarios, loudly claiming, "That dog barked for hours last night," even when neighbors knew it wasn't true. The family began to feel cornered. Their beloved pet, who had never harmed a soul, was being painted as a monster, and with the HOA backing Karen, the pressure mounted. Each envelope from the HOA mailbox felt heavier, more threatening. What made it worse was the chilling realization that they weren't just dealing with Karen, they were dealing with an entire system, the HOA that was supposed to represent fairness but had instead become Karen's weapon. Late one evening, as the family gathered in the living room with Max at their feet, they knew something had to change. Karen wasn't going to stop. The HOA wasn't going to back down. They had 2 choices: surrender to the pressure, or fight back with everything they had. And in that moment, a decision was made. The family would no longer play defense. They were going to expose Karen, and if necessary, the HOA itself. Whatever it took, they would make sure the truth came out. But they had no idea just how deep the corruption ran, or how many secrets were waiting to be uncovered. The war for Max had only just begun. The tension in the neighborhood was no longer subtle. Everyone could feel it. The once friendly cul-de-sac had turned into a battleground, with Karen on one side and the family on the other. But the family had reached their breaking point. Enough was enough. If Karen and the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And this time, it wouldn't be fought in whispers or with petty notices. It would be fought with evidence, strategy, and the support of the very community Karen had been tormenting for months. The first step was gathering proof. The family decided to install security cameras around their property. Not only would this protect them from false claims, but it would also capture Karen's behavior in real time. Within days, the cameras began recording clips of her antics. The footage was revealing. Karen would stand outside with her phone, pretending to record the dog barking when Max was lying silently on the porch. Sometimes she would stage elaborate scenes, clapping loudly or rattling objects, then claiming the dog was reacting aggressively. But on camera, Max could be seen calmly wagging his tail, completely unbothered. The recordings didn't just disprove her complaints. They exposed her lies in full. At the same time, the family began reaching out to neighbors. At first, many were hesitant. After all, nobody wanted to get on Karen's bad side, but as conversations unfolded, a pattern emerged. Karen hadn't just targeted this family, she had harassed nearly everyone on the block. Some had been fined for grass too long, others for holiday decorations too bright. A few even admitted Karen had threatened to report them to the HOA unless they followed her personal rules. With this newfound support, the family realized they weren't alone. Karen had been operating in the shadows, using intimidation and the HOA's authority to control people. But now, the neighbors had a chance to push back together. The next HOA meeting was their battleground. The family prepared meticulously. They compiled video clips of Karen's false accusations. They gathered written statements from neighbors who had been bullied by her. They printed reports from animal control officers who had cleared Max of any wrongdoing. By the time the meeting rolled around, they had a stack of evidence so thick it could barely fit into a binder. When the night arrived, the HOA board sat at the front of the community center, their expressions stern and unreadable. Karen sat proudly in the front row, arms crossed, smugness radiating from her like perfume. She looked certain that the family would be cornered and embarrassed, but that confidence began to crack the moment the family presented their case. One by one, they played the camera footage on a projector screen. Karen's face turned pale as clips showed her staging fake scenarios, clapping her hands while accusing Max of barking, or pointing her phone dramatically at a silent yard. Gasps rippled through the room as neighbors realized the extent of her deception. Then came the statements. From fellow residents, neighbor after neighbor stepped forward, each recounting their own stories of harassment. Stories of intimidation, of unfair fines, of Karen threatening to report them unless they complied with her absurd demands. The picture was clear. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a neighborhood tyrant. The HOA board shifted uncomfortably. They had sided with Karen for months, sending fines and warnings without question. Now, confronted with undeniable evidence, their credibility was on the line. If they didn't act, it would prove they were complicit in her schemes. Karen, meanwhile, erupted. She stood up, shouting over the speakers, insisting the evidence was fake, that the neighbors were lying, that she was the victim of a conspiracy. But the louder she yelled, the more unhinged she looked, and every outburst was another nail in her coffin. By the end of the meeting, the tide had turned completely. The board, red-faced and defensive, announced they would review the evidence and reconsider the fines against the family. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. For the first time, Karen's grip on the neighborhood had been shaken, yet the family wasn't satisfied. Clearing Max's name was important, but this fight had become bigger than their dog. It was about fairness, about exposing corruption, about ensuring no one else would suffer at Karen's hands. Behind the scenes, they began digging deeper into the HOA itself. With the help of a neighbor who had some legal knowledge, they started examining HOA records, financial statements, and past complaints. What they found was shocking. Karen wasn't just influencing the board. She had friends on it. One of the board members was her cousin. Another was a longtime friend. Together, they had created a system where Karen's complaints were fast-tracked, while others were ignored or dismissed. Even more alarming, there were irregularities in the HOA's finances, questionable expenses, vague charges, and missing funds. The harassment of Max was just the tip of the iceberg. The family realized they had stumbled onto something much larger, a network of corruption that could take down not just Karen, but the entire HOA leadership, and they weren't about to let that opportunity slip away. As they organized the next steps, Karen grew more desperate. She doubled down on her campaign, filing more complaints, leaving angry notes on the family's door, and even threatening lawsuits. But her desperation only fueled the family's determination. The neighborhood was watching, and for the first time, Karen wasn't feared. She was mocked at. Children imitated her rants on the playground. Neighbors rolled their eyes as she stomped past. What was once fear had transformed into ridicule, but the real showdown was still ahead. The family had the evidence, the community's support, and a plan to bring everything crashing down. The question wasn't whether Karen would lose. It was how spectacularly she and her allies in the HOA would fall. The neighborhood was buzzing. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. Karen's once commanding voice now rang hollow as neighbors quietly laughed behind her back. For years, she had been the self-appointed sheriff of the community, the enforcer of her own made-up rules. But after the last HOA meeting, cracks were spreading in her carefully crafted image. The family knew this was their moment. They had already cleared Max's name in the eyes of most of their neighbors, but that wasn't enough. The truth about Karen and her allies on the HOA board needed to come to light in a way that nobody could ignore. The family's dining room had become a war room. Papers, highlighters, and sticky notes covered the table. Their neighbor with legal experience guided them through HOA bylaws, state property codes, and nonprofit regulations. What started as an attempt to defend their dog had now grown into something much larger, a mission to expose corruption. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Karen's cousin, who sat on the board, had personally approved fines, issued to families she disliked. HOA funds had been used for community improvements that suspiciously matched upgrades to Karen's property, like the freshly paved driveway that nobody else received, or the new fencing conveniently installed around her yard at the association's expense. Even more damning was the discovery of administrative fees charged to homeowners. Money that disappeared into vague accounts with no explanation. Year after year, thousands of dollars vanished. And the people signing off on it were always the same. Karen's circle. The family now had a dossier thick enough to rival a legal case. But evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed a strategy, one that would not only reveal the corruption, but also ensure Karen and her allies couldn't sweep it under the rug. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. By the time it arrived, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. Chairs had to be pulled from storage, and people lined the walls. It wasn't just another routine session, it felt like a trial. And everyone knew who was sitting in the defendant's chair. Karen, dressed in her usual pastel sweater and oversized sunglasses, indoor sat with her arms crossed, whispering furiously to her cousin on the board. She still held herself with arrogance, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her fear. The meeting opened, as usual, with the board trying to rush through agenda items. But before they could move on, the family stood and requested the floor. Silence fell over the room as they placed a binder on the podium, its pages neatly tabbed and marked. First came the financial irregularities. They laid out charts showing unexplained expenses, highlighting suspicious payments tied directly to Karen's property. They displayed copies of invoices, HOA records, and bank statements obtained through homeowner rights. Each slide drew murmurs from the crowd. Then came the testimonies. Neighbor after neighbor stood up, emboldened by the evidence already presented. They spoke of years of harassment, of unfair fines, of Karen's threats. Each story added weight to the case, painting a picture of systematic abuse of power. And finally, the family revealed the most devastating piece of evidence: video footage. Clips rolled on the projector of Karen staging false complaints against Max, yelling at children, riding bikes, even berating delivery drivers for stopping too long in front of her house. The audience was stunned, some gasping, others laughing at the sheer absurdity. Karen's face turned crimson. She shouted, interrupting, calling the evidence doctored, and accusing the family of slander. But every time she tried to defend herself, she only made things worse. Her cousin on the board attempted to intervene, but the crowd erupted, demanding answers. For the first time in years, the balance of power had shifted. The board could no longer protect her. Under pressure, the remaining board members announced an emergency vote. The community would decide whether Karen and her allies should remain in lead or should poor be removed. The room buzzed with anticipation as ballots were distributed. Neighbors who had once been silent now held their pens with determination. It was more than a vote, it was liberation. When the ballots were counted, the result was overwhelming. By a landslide, the community voted to remove Karen's cousin and his allies from the board. Karen herself, though not officially on the board, was banned from filing further complaints without verifiable evidence. The announcement sparked applause, then cheers. Neighbors clapped each other on the back, some even hugging in relief. For the first time in years, they felt free from the grip of one woman's control. Karen, meanwhile, sat frozen, her sunglasses trembling on her face. She stood abruptly, muttering insults under her breath, and stormed out of the building with her Pomeranian in tow. The slam of the door was met with laughter. The HOA board was restructured that very night. A group of residents, including the family's legal-minded neighbor, stepped in to ensure transparency moving forward. Plans were made to audit the HOA's finances and restore the funds that had been misused. As for Max, he became something of a neighborhood hero. Neighbors often stopped to pet him on walks, joking that he had taken down Karen. Children made up chants about him, and some even drew posters with his face on them, hanging them in their windows. What started as an attack on a family's beloved dog had ended with the collapse of a corrupt system. Karen, stripped of her influence, became a ghost in the community. She no longer shouted from her porch or filed complaints. Instead, she kept to herself. Blinds drawn, her once pristine yard, now neglected. Without the HOA's backing, she was powerless. The family, though exhausted from the ordeal, felt a deep sense of victory. They hadn't just defended Max, they had defended their neighbors, their homes, and their right to live in peace. The community was closer now, united by the shared struggle against a common enemy, and though Karen still lived there, her reign was over. She wasn't the neighborhood's ruler anymore. She was its punchline. What once had been whispered in fear was now spoken openly, with laughter. Remember when Karen tried to get rid of a dog and lost her throne instead? The neighborhood would never forget, and neither would Karen.